And welcome everybody to our space weather video about fields and features of the closest star. Coming at you from the Smash News Network, least busted name in news. We're starting out by looking at magnetohydrodynamic pressure modeled by the Space Weather Modeling Framework. We see a continued elevated pressure here. You can see some perturbations there happening over the past 4 hours to Earth's magnetic moment from space. You're looking at magnetohydrodynamic pressure here. If you want to read about the Space Weather Modeling Framework, go to the Geospace Magnetosphere Movies, click on Details, that tab down there at the bottom, and there'll be a link to the Space Weather Modeling Framework. Next thing we're looking at is the plasma sheet. The Sun is putting out a heliospheric current sheet, and the plasma in said sheet is oriented to one solar polar field or the other. Earth is in a south pole oriented plasma sheet. The heliospheric current sheet. We're not expecting any changes anytime soon. Keep in mind the magnetic environment can suddenly change. So here are the GOES magnetometers over the past 3 days. And we're seeing a little bit more smooth readings there, an indication that we're seeing a subsiding of coronal hole winds. But there are more on the way, as there are a whole series of South Pole-oriented coronal holes in the earthly zone. We'll show you that in a minute. First, the line of sight ecliptic plane field plot. Here is the heliospheric current sheet from Earth's perspective, as well as the solar magnetogram. If you watched our previous space weather video for the day, you may have realized that solar activity has actually dropped since yesterday. Next, the line of sight coronal hole plot. It shows you the Sun's B field in blue here. Those potential field surface source lines in blue are the Sun's B field. The field going through the magnet of the Sun, and those red areas are South Pole-oriented coronal holes. So quite a few of them. Some of them are getting more defined, and you'll see them as forecasted over here, getting a little bit more defined. There's a bunch of bumpy plasma in between us and those coronal holes. Those are cool spots, and they are what you'd call low pressure zones. On the Sun, they're extreme low pressure zones because coronal holes are blasting out protons, which are partially responsible for the creation of the heliospheric current sheet. All those coronal holes, these down here and over here, they're all South Pole oriented. And 193 angstroms from the SDO is a great wavelength to view coronal holes. Next, we'll move to sunspots, which have degraded a bit here over the past 24 hours. We still do have 4 major sunspot groups, although 2936 has set. I'll say 3 major sunspot groups: 2939, 2940, and 2941, all beta class at least. 2941 remains the most interesting of all the sunspots. It's beta gamma class. Likelihood of flare is still quite high here, and statistically speaking, we've seen sunspots underperforming, so don't be surprised to see some solar flares. Here's the 1700 angstroms view, part of the ultraviolet wavelength. It's just showing extreme ultraviolet here, and great view there of those sunspots. Again, most likely spot to see a large flare, in my opinion, is indeed from sunspot 2941 here in the northeastern corner, rather. Let's look at some more local information. So no major flares here. We did see a C-class flare as we did show prep here. It's like a long duration flare happening. No M-class flares here for several days. We'll be keeping an eye on it. And when I say ion, well, pardon the pun. Speaking of ions, no spikes in the proton flux. No relativistic particles showing up at Earth. There was a bit of a coronal mass ejection strike, a very short-lived little bit of ejecta likely showing up here, raising the solar wind density to over 20 protons per cubic centimeter for a brief period there, raising the speed up to about 630 kilometers per second. It was very short-lived, just a little bit of ejecta showing up there. Current conditions are still elevated at the solar wind speed, 536 kilometers per second, solar wind density 11.3 protons per cubic centimeter. KP index at 3, that's a measurement of global geomagnetism for you new viewers. Geomagnetic calm conditions. And we may see geomagnetic unrest return here, although we did see the BZ just return to 2. So the field does affect the induction of electrical current into the earthly system. Speaking of the solar system, here's where stuff's located. We'll show you the 1-week forecast. Here's where things will be in a week. We'll have a gibbous waxing a couple days before the next full moon there on the 13th. Here's a star chart. We like people to be oriented. Here's some astrography. If you're up before dawn, you may see Mars, Venus, and Mercury rising ahead of the Sun. If you've got a low horizon especially, Saturn and the Sun nearly overlapping at the moment. And here's our coronal mass ejection watch. Looking at coronagraphs here from stereo A on the left and the LASCO C3 on the right. No coronal mass ejections at the moment. Things are looking pretty smooth. We're seeing a reduction in solar activity. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Congratulations on realizing the channel exists. I've been your host, Dan, a.k.a. Smash-O-Mash, signing off from the Smash News Network. Least busted. Name in news.